and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. I promised each week we take a look at the story behind the story. I'm excited to have my Quincy Institute colleague, Brett Heinz, to share one of those stories, and likely one that you've never heard of, even though it has been happening for 30 years in relative plain view. Brett is a security and foreign influence research assistant at the Quincy Institute. He previously served as a program assistant at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He and another colleague, Ben Freeman, recently published a report, a very well-researched report entitled Subsidizing the Military-Industrial Complex, a review of the Secretary of Defense Executive Fellows Program, SDEF. Now, it's a pretty innocuous title, you might say, but what they found is much more compelling, and not so much in a good way. What they found is that the American taxpayer, you and I, pay to send U.S. military officers to work at major corporations for 1 year, ostensibly to have them return to the fold with all sorts of suggestions for the DoD bureaucracy on how it might improve its management, its purchasing, its efficiency. But it's much more insidious than that. What I'd like to do, Brett, and thank you for coming on, is can you talk a little bit about the origins and the scope of this particular program and why embedding military officers and corporations for a year might not be the benefit that the government says it is?
Sure. So the Secretary of Defense Executive Fellows Program, I always abbreviate it to SDEF, which I've said so much now it sounds like a real word to me. So if you hear me referring to it, you know what I mean. Yes. SDEF was formed in 1995 and fielded its first cohort of fellows, which are essentially military officers who are believed to have potential for rising further up the ranks in the military. Originally, 5 of them were selected, and the idea was that they would be sent to a major corporation to work there for approximately a year. And then at the end of this fellowship, this year-long fellowship, they would return to the Department of Defense, and they would present senior DoD policymakers with ideas for how the Pentagon could reform itself or could improve its performance based on things that these private corporations are doing. This came from the backdrop in the 90s. I think its origins were probably Al Gore, vice president at the time, had a reinventing government program that he was doing where he was trying to bring in more efficiency to the government. And a lot of that involved looking at the private sector. I think that the Defense Department probably was looking for ways to fit themselves into that larger program. And as such, one of their ideas was, which came straight from the top, it came from William J. Perry, former defense secretary, was to create a program of this sort that could harvest some of the information accumulating in the private sector about new innovations in business, about new innovations in technology that could have businesses work more effectively. So the intentions of it were really pretty good. It was to try to streamline bureaucracy in the DoD, to try to prove their effectiveness. Unfortunately, the program wasn't really designed with full awareness of the fact that for-profit corporations have a very different set of interests than the government does. The government is trying to serve the interests of the American citizens, ideally, American citizens, taxpayers, and so on. And in that sense, it has a very broad public-leaning mission, while these corporations that we are trying to learn from have much more narrow for-profit focuses, which are very solely focused on doing what's best for the company. So what we found in the report, and which I'm sure we'll dig more into, is the fact that this program has often served as a way for these corporations to pressure the Department of Defense into adopting pro-corporate policies, and then claiming that they're just sort of trying to help the DoD out.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I know, just like you had just explained, where the impetus is from. And I remember succinctly in the 90s is when I started doing reporting professionally. And I remember it was a real big deal for the Pentagon, the military, to open up to the private sector with the idea that the taxpayers would save money, that things would be done more efficiently than the DoD bureaucracy. So I know where it comes from. It's this sense that the that the open market knows better. And like you said, the incentive structure is quite different on the other end. And we've seen this throughout the entire global war on terror when the United States government, the military, had to depend more and more on private contractors to wage the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that all of a sudden, it seemed as though we were working for them as opposed to the other way. But I don't want to get off topic here. Can you talk a little bit about how this program, this fellows program, operates in practice? Like, take us through what actually happens each year.
Yeah, for sure. Well, essentially, the military puts out postings for soldiers and for military officers to read that are a variety of fellowships and educational opportunities within the military each year. And they'll put out bulletins and things of that sort. And one of the opportunities that they offer certain military officers of a certain rank the ability to apply for is this SDEF program. And they say, come on board and it will work as an educational experience, and it will give you some business experience as well that might help you out later on in your career, wink, wink. And basically, once they receive all these applications, they go through each military service independently, selects some of their applicants that they think would be good for the program and sends them forward. Once these applicants have been selected, they're flown out to the Washington, D.C. area for about a month to receive a orientation and training program, which is a month-long series of meetings and sort of mini classes, including what they call a mini MBA, a mini business degree at the University of Virginia. And they receive a lot of training, sort of not only on business practices and what they might expect in the private sector, but also on current affairs, on what the military is up to, on what the military is interested in and what they want to learn more about.
Now can I just stop you? That sounds very interesting to me. So they're learning about general business practices, but also current events, that foreign policy, international affairs. Yeah, I mean, that seems a little bit out of scope for what this executive fellows program is supposed to be, but it seems like like what you said, a month-long retreat in which they're indoctrinated into both business but also ideological affairs.
Yeah, it's a bit of a strange combination. So one of the organizations that helps to organize these orientations is a think tank called the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, CSBA. And the way that they describe it is that they're trying to make the connection between what's going on in the business world on the one hand and what's going on in the Pentagon on another, and to try to help these officers put things together to help realize how something going on in the business world might be able to help the Pentagon. In practice, though, you use the word indoctrination. I don't think that's at all an appropriate term to use here. We found pretty strong political biases in terms of the types of people who are invited to speak here, particularly in favor of neoconservatism and of neoconservative policymakers from the Bush administration, as well as from the think tank world. We note in the report that among the orientations we looked at about 15 years worth of schedules. They invited think tank officials from 9 right-wing think tanks and 1 left-wing think tank, which I think goes to show that there is, in fact, something of an agenda here in what terms of what kind of messaging they're trying to deliver upon these officers. So there, even at this early stage of the program, there are already some issues you see, not only with this sort of ideological aspect, but also in terms of really close connections to the corporate sector already, because we found for a couple of years that these orientations were actually very closely linked to Booz Allen Hamilton, the contracting giant. And for a couple of years, even held part of their orientations inside of the offices of Booz Allen Hamilton.
Wow. So I don't know if you can share with me, but what would the left-wing think tank be?
So it was New America, who is really center-left, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that it's interesting because you look at this right-wing list and it's like the Hall of Fame of neoconservative policymakers. Right. And then they brought in one singular guy from a pretty mainstream center-left think tank who's just also there, I suppose. And it shows pretty quickly that there is a connection here that on one level or another, they have realized that the impetus of neoconservatism is very closely aligned with the impetus of these pro-corporate policies that the program's turning out.
Absolutely. And, the New America gets a lot of its money from defense contractors and government contracts. And it's just, I feel like they are solidly within the sort of narrow band of acceptable frameworks of how they're thinking about war and military policy, not so much a restraint oriented like the Quincy Institute, but have more of a centrist engagement in terms of who their fellows are and their audience. But it doesn't really stray outside of the contours of being a pro-military, pro-status quo formula. And so it's interesting that, they'll say, oh, well, we're engaging left and right, or we're engaging all views, or, both sides of the spectrum. But it's really like what is acceptable within that narrow band.
Yeah, they really don't reach outside of what, some might typically call the blob of U.S. foreign policy. Right. Every single person basically within these presentations who's presenting to these military officers fits very neatly within the mainstream spectrum of U.S. foreign policy, which of course is a very, very interventionist, very non-restraint-based ideology. Right. And the think tank that I mentioned, CSBA, who helps to organize these orientations, they also very much fall within this. We found that they're quite heavily funded by defense contractors themselves, which gives them their own sort of monetary interest in how this program turns out and the sort of policies it turns out. Because if they're able to produce a cohort of fellows who advocate for policies that are friendly to defense contractors, then they're advocating for policies that are friendly towards their donors.
Right.
And we even found, I think it was 16 maybe, 16 different companies where they benefited from the SDEF program and also were donors to the CSBA. So a lot of these companies are sort of dipping their fingers into the program in multiple different ways.
It's very incestuous. So just because I want to get to as much of the report as possible. So what happens after this indoctrination? And did you say it was 2 months or a month or?
Yeah, it's a month. Mm-hmm. Okay. About 3 weeks, actually, I think. So yeah, after this 3-week period, they're assigned to different companies at the discretion of the organizer of the program. And we looked into the full list of all the companies that they have been sent to, and we found that military contractors and government contractors more broadly are wildly overrepresented among this sample.
Surprise.
Surprise, surprise. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon are all in the top 4 recipients of fellows for this program. And I believe that we found 29% of all fellows who have ever gone through the program go to one of the top 50 government contractors. So once they arrive at one of these organizations, they're assigned roles based on their own experience and skills, but also on what the corporation thinks they could best use them for. And in practice, this has been a variety of things, everything from IT to business strategy. In a lot of cases, though, it also does come down to government relations and essentially lobbying roles. We found 18 different companies that had sent their fellows to work in roles where they're basically interfacing with the DoD, who is their employer, trying to get more business for the company.
Unbelievable.
It's a really, really blatant conflict of interest, which just sort of stares you in the face. And yeah, so they do a year of work at these various organizations. And for each fellow in each company, that varies differently what that year exactly looks like. And by the end of it, they come back and present what's called an out briefing, which is essentially a PowerPoint presentation to a handful of senior policymakers in the DoD. So the leader of each independent military service, some of the people on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, assistant secretaries of defense, and things of this sort. And their outbrief basically reviews, most of them review what their experience was at the company briefly, and then what their recommendations are based on the time they spent at the company. And what we found in our review of these recommendations is, as you might imagine, based on everything we've discussed so far, a shockingly large number of them are pro-contractor, pro-corporate reforms, which would in some cases benefit even specifically the company where a fellow was hosting at.
It's unreal, but I'm not surprised. So what you're telling me is a corporation or a company like Lockheed Martin, which has a small army of lobbyists on the Hill on any given day, are able to basically obtain another lobbyist for free because a senior officer will go over for a year to Lockheed and learn the trade of government relations, and be able to interact with the company, know what the company needs, what it wants, what its desires, what its plans are, and then comes back and gets a briefing with the top officials in the E-ring, so to speak, in which they can convey all of that to the key target audience. I mean, this is what lobbyists do. This is the sort of ultimate get, is to have an audience with all of these general assistant secretaries of defense and be able to convey a direct message from the company as to what they need and want. So, and you and I are paying for it. The American taxpayer is paying for a lobbyist. that goes off the books on the other end. They don't need to pay for it.
When you look at it laid out, it really is pretty incredible. But I mean, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of that is exactly the problem here. From the company's perspective, a lot of these companies would kill. They would pay millions of dollars to have just 5 minutes to have all of these senior DoD policymakers sitting down in a room and looking over this presentation of whatever they want to present to them.
Right.
And this program essentially offers a way to say, no, you don't have to pay anything. We're going to pay so that you can have one of our officers, someone who appears to be from the inside of the U.S. military, in effect, presenting on your behalf to DoD policymakers. And when you look at the sort of things that they present, of course, they've made a really wide variety of policy recommendations. And a lot of it is very mundane reforms. To be clear, the program does put out a lot of recommendations for reform that are pretty normal. But then you look at the rest of it. And, we were talking about Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin fellows are coming here and saying, we need to loosen the rules around how many weapons we're allowed to export to foreign nations. We should be able to send more weapons to Egypt. And this would actually help national security because it would help Lockheed Martin. It would help our bottom line, and a strong corporate economy helps to benefit U.S. national security. And they essentially, for free, have someone just telling DoD policymakers this.
Unreal. So now, just to be fair, the program is not just targeted to defense companies. There are other companies in far-flung fields that these senior officers are embedding with each year. So this wasn't designed specifically to be some pipeline between the Pentagon and the defense industry, but it was designed to have senior officers glean business practice, business knowledge to come back and try to apply that to, I would imagine, procurement and acquisitions. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the ratio between defense companies that are getting these embeds and other types of private corporations?
Sure. And yeah, you make the point. This program was never originally designed to be for defense contractors. I think probably what happened in the beginning was they were seeking interest from companies. They were reaching out and saying, would you be interested in participating in this new fellowship? And the largest amount of interest they got was from defense contractors. So those relationships probably just formed naturally because the defense contractors thought, oh, wow, that's a great deal for us. But, as you mentioned, probably a majority of all companies involved are not major government contractors, probably a slim majority. But even though they aren't really dealing with the government one-on-one in business in the same way as the contractors, which is the reason that we focused a lot of the report on the contractors, these situations still can pose some ethical issues because every business really has something that they could ask for from the largest agency in the US government with such an enormous budget, so much money flowing around in so many different directions. We documented examples where Caterpillar, the bulldozer, the construction company, They do a lot of machinery rentals, and they had a fellow come to the DoD after working there for a year and said, DoD should probably use more machinery rentals. And then, they had another fellow later on who was even more specific, and it's like, you should specifically use Caterpillar's technology for underwater mining, I think is what it was, which is bizarrely specific.
Yeah.
But, you come across all these instances where they send a guy off to work for CVS Health for a year, even something that just seems totally innocuous. And then they come back, and the recommendation for what the policy recommendations of what DoD should do is work with CVS more, start partnering with CVS. So whatever the company is, even the companies that don't have these most direct conflicts of interest, this program gives them a way to essentially ask the DoD for whatever sort of policy might benefit whatever industry they're operating in.
And I would imagine this is a pretty competitive program in that senior officers see this as an opportunity to get out of whatever humdrum role they are playing within the military structure, whatever rank they are and where they're deployed, to get a year working in a routine manner in some corporation that's not going to put them at the lower rung, but in the executive offices, or I would nearabouts, in a company that might be based in an exciting city. Maybe it's in Washington, maybe other places, but I would imagine that they don't have a dearth of applications for this program every year.
Yeah, I would agree. My guess is that it is probably a very competitive program. As you mentioned, the benefits for joining this sort of program as a military officer are pretty significant. One funny little quirk that we came across is that the program is treated as an educational program. So whatever way that the independent military services, the Navy, the Army, et cetera, however they consider an educational program counting towards service requirements, this program does as well.
Wow.
Which means that taking this program for a year, if you're in the Navy, counts as 3 years of military service.
Jeez, 3 years.
3 years, you get triple time, I believe, under Navy policies for educational programs towards your service requirements. So doing this for a year and working at a private company, you're then allowed to come back and have 3 more years on your record, equivalent of service time. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that's incredible, because if anybody knows the military, they know that a lot of these guys and gals are counting their time to the 20-year retirement. Because a 20-year retirement could mean that you're retiring at the ripe old age of, say, 41, 42, 43, and then you have an entire another career ahead of you. And if you're already seeding the prospects by working directly with a defense contractor, for example, you may have that second career already clearly laid out. You can go in there, collect your pension from the U.S. military, and then make, a lobbyist salary, which is not insignificant for one of these companies. And so getting that 3-year means that you're accelerating that process without having to go to war or do any of the grunt work of being in the U.S. military. Really, you're going in, you're working a white collar job for a year.
Yeah. There was something that was in an earlier draft of the report, which we ultimately removed because it was just kind of a tangent. It's not relevant, but it was funny as a story. In one of the PowerPoints that we were reviewing, the out briefings that they present each year, they left comments from the fellows attached to them in the final version on the Defense Department's website.
Oh.
And it was kind of interesting. And there was a comment from one of the fellows working on the slideshow that was basically saying, I know that we all joke around about these educational programs being time off, but nonetheless, and then they continue saying whatever. So it's clear that a lot of these fellows are looking at it from this perspective, which is just like, compared to the actual hard work that you have to do in a lot of DoD positions, this is really pretty nice. It's just sort of like a year off doing a paid tour of the private sector. And that was the part that we decided to look at for the final part of the report, is where do they go afterwards? We were curious if there was a pronounced effect of this program in terms of putting people into the revolving door to go back into these defense contractors and these weapons companies after the military. And we found there's a huge effect, or, maybe self-selection, but 43% of all the people who went through this program will ultimately work for a government contractor at some point after leaving the program.
Yeah.
Which, based on one comparison we did to a larger sample of DoD officials, appears to be at more than double the rate that people normally enter the revolving door while leaving the Defense Department. Yeah.
I mean, they're building those relationships. I mean, like in real time, very tangibly. That's and I think that's what is the insidious part of this. I don't see a lot of benefit in terms of the original mission of this program, running things more efficiently at the Pentagon, for example, having senior officers with all of a sudden a skill set to come back and do things differently, because we know that stuff isn't happening. And we could have an entire other show about how inefficient this, the planet of the Defense Department is. But what it really is doing is actually furthering, or at least building, relationships between individual senior officers and these companies for post-retirement, in addition to, the relationship building that gets these companies more contracts. And also, and it's not just contracts, it's the policy desires. And you mentioned regulations, red tape, some of these things that the Defense Department or these defense contractors are consistently lobbying for, ways to make more money faster with less oversight. Let's just kind of encapsulate it there. They're able to argue for these things by having this interlocutor, this senior officer being able to make the case for them in front of the E-ring. So this does remind me a little bit, and I don't know if you've done any work on this, Brett, or if you've just come across it in your research, where the embedding of senior officers at think tanks. And I don't know if that's a specific program, but I know it goes on, where you have active duty officers who are on the masthead and the about page of think tanks like the Center for New American Security, CNAS, for example, or CSIS. It does seem to have the same fundamentals, that somehow you send an officer to a think tank to talk about these grand strategy issues, or more granular, like China, Taiwan, or NATO and European security, as a way to somehow beef up their knowledge. But it would seem to me that it's having the almost an opposite. It's more like they are either being indoctrinated, or the think tank itself is sort of shaping its work and its goals and mission around that of the Pentagon, which is literally embedded in their organization.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point. It is similar in a certain sense, where the idea behind, so you're right, they have a lot of these. It's not a program in itself, but I think they have one-on-one agreements where they'll send military officers as fellows to CNAS, the Hudson Institute, organizations like this, all organizations which are pretty interventionist in their outlook, pretty well within the mainstream as well of what is considered acceptable Washington foreign policy. And the idea is that, well, they're expanding their knowledge base, they're drawing in more information from a broader array of sources, and this is going to come back to help the Pentagon. In reality, a lot of what it's doing is sort of just tightening the links between different parts of the military-industrial complex. All of these different organizations that already have the ideological affiliations with one another, that already share a lot of goals, are now just sort of having staff members swap back and forth between these different institutions and bringing them all closer together into alliance with one another.
Yeah.
Which in itself is, I think, a pretty concerning development in terms of actually having a U.S. foreign policy that represents the interests of the American people at large, of having a foreign policy that's subject to democratic pressures, because you're just creating this very small bubble of a couple of organizations who all fundamentally agree with one another, hashing out all of these differences in themselves. And that was one of the most disturbing things to me, I think, of what I found among the policy recommendations being made by SDEF fellows, was just the talk about, We need to give contractors more political power. We need to create government-sponsored forums that brings together the CEOs of these organizations and lets them help us craft national security strategy. This is something they explicitly talk about as like a reform to help the Pentagon. And it's, these are the leaders of weapons companies are the last people on earth who should be helping us to craft national security strategy. And I think that line between public interest and private interest gets blurred in these sorts of programs.
I'm so happy that you did this report with our colleague, Ben Freeman. Can you talk a little bit, because I know that you have other irons in the fire, what you guys are doing, but can you talk a little bit more broadly for our audience here about the type of work that you and Ben are doing at Quincy, and maybe give us a little peek into what we might expect from you in the future?
Sure. So Ben and I are at the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute. And our goal is essentially looking at foreign policy for what it is, which is the least democratic part of our government. It involves the least amount of input from the public at large and the most amount of input from very small, concentrated special interests, both in the government bureaucracy and also in the corporate world. And we're trying to look at the variety of ways that these interests, whether they be foreign governments, from Saudi Arabia, or whether they be weapons companies like Lockheed Martin, the ways that these organizations are trying to pressure U.S. foreign policymakers into taking a militarist course of action, into encouraging more war, into encouraging less diplomacy, and essentially just keeping the money rolling for a lot of these companies that are funded by the Department of Defense and these governments who are backed by the U.S. Defense Department. So we're trying to do a lot more research into the ways that these organizations are pressuring policymakers towards making decisions that are not really in the public interest, and trying to ask what would the public interest look like if the public really did get a role in saying what U.S. foreign policy should look like. As for sneak peeks, I don't know how much I can offer at this point in time, but work is ongoing. I have something coming soon that's going to be on a brief history of foreign bribery in Congress, hitting on the Henry Cuellar and the recent Senator Menendez scandals. So more will be coming. Keep an eye out.
Excellent. I'm very proud to work with you, and I'm very proud of the project that you and Ben are fronting. This is not a advertisement for Quincy. I really do believe in it, and I think what I'm trying to do with this show is to sort of get under the hood and explain to people. I have no doubt that anyone watching this show now and in the future have some sense that there is corruption in Washington, particularly with the military industrial complex. What I think is important is to show it in detail so that people know and are able to counteract. They're able to maybe call their members of Congress, vote with their feet. I feel like there is this general sense of, the swamp in Washington. And then there's really the granular detail. And I feel like that gets lost, or it's so unwieldy sometimes that people's eyes glaze over. But what I want to do is exactly what you guys are doing with the program is like, okay, let's show people and show how this affects them. That's the most important thing is you're paying for this. You're paying for these embeds, and that's just a tiny, small drop in the bucket of this, this blob that we talk about all the time. But, hopefully we can just sort of just like put a little more chink, in the armor here. So thank you so much for coming on and be happy, to host you again on your next report or story that you're doing for Quincy or Responsible Statecraft. And we can find your report with Ben on the Quincy Institute website, quincyinst.org. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.